listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you. Welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up later in our deep dive, we speak with one of the Australian professors involved in that incredible world-first titanium heart that is set to revolutionise heart transplants. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 13th of March. Former Australian cricketing great Stuart MacGill has been found guilty of facilitating a $330,000 cocaine deal underneath his Sydney restaurant. The jury returned the guilty verdict after an 8-day trial in the New South Wales District Court. MacGill was found not guilty of taking part in the supply of a large commercial quantity of a prohibited drug. He is set to face sentencing later this year. Power bills are set to increase from the 1st of July for hundreds of thousands of Australian households and businesses, with prices set to climb by up to 9% for some in New South Wales, around 6% across southeast Queensland, and an estimated 5% in South Australia. The energy regulator has justified the increase, saying inflation, coal outages and sluggish renewables are all contributing factors. But the Federal Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, isn't ruling out some extra bill relief.
We've had 2 rounds of energy bill relief. As the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and I have made clear, we will always consider what more can be done. There's a budget coming soon and we'll continue that approach of considering what more we can do.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton has hit out at the federal government's energy policy, saying it's a disaster, and has also called for Chris Bowen to be sacked.
If the government's just splashing cash out there, that's going to keep upward pressure on interest rates for longer. And as the Reserve Bank Governor points out, we've got a homegrown problem here with inflation because of spending by the government.
There are reports an American influencer's visa is now under review after confronting content was posted to social media involving a baby wombat. The video shows Sam Jones, who is a self-described hunter influencer, taking a baby wombat from its mother. This is some of the audio from the post, which has now been deleted.
Just caught a baby wombat. Look at the mother. It's like, oh, it's chasing after her.
It's not clear where in Australia the footage was filmed. We understand authorities are investigating whether immigration law has been breached and are considering whether there are grounds to deport Sam Jones. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Professor Chris Hayward. He is a cardiologist at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney and was one of the extraordinary team involved in a world first for heart transplants. A titanium artificial heart, which was designed by Queensland inventor Daniel Timms, was implanted into a man who was suffering severe heart failure late last year. He became the first person in the world to be discharged from hospital with the high-tech device, and now the breakthrough is being hailed a major success. It's also set to revolutionise how we manage heart failure and transplants in the future. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. How much of a breakthrough is this for Australian research, but right around the world?
This is really exciting. It's a new kind of pump. It does something that our current pumps don't do, and it has the potential to change the way that we manage patients long-term, transplant patients, as an option of alternative to transplant. Not quite there yet, but that's where we're headed.
So from what I can understand, this artificial heart, and we'll get to the inventor, which is a great story shortly, but this artificial heart was used in this Australian man for the first time as a bit of a stopgap because he had heart failure and was waiting for a heart transplant. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it's what we call a bridge to transplant implant. And so it's a way of supporting someone who otherwise wouldn't make it to transplant because they're too sick, and getting them in better conditions so they get through the transplant operation.
And this patient, I understand, that had this has become the first person in the world to be discharged from hospital with the titanium heart, and he had it for 100 days before getting a transplant.
So there have been 5 other implants in America, all of whom stayed in intensive care or coronary care, high dependency units, and then were transplanted within 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. And so our fellow went out to over 3 months, discharged from hospital. And that is significant because there's no sort of backup if there's a pump fail. So, we were putting complete faith in the pump that it would continue to work, that he would be able to change the batteries by himself, look after himself and all those sort of things, which he did without any problem.
Considering it hadn't worked overseas, Professor, was that a big risk, or did you guys think, okay, we know this pump's going to work and we put full faith in the technology and also the person that's operating it?
Yeah, look, we'd been using it and working with the pump previously, and we'd been over to America and seen the implants and seen the patients for the first few days after their implant. So we knew what the pump could do. And there are all sorts of design backups and redundancies making it unlikely to fail. But you're always nervous, so you're still, relying on technology. And we all know that even computers can sometimes do funny things.
They can indeed. Professor, what's amazing about this? We'll get to the question about what this means long term for medicine and heart transplants and heart failure, which is incredible. But the story about who invented this titanium heart pump is quite extraordinary. From what I can understand, it was invented by Daniel Timms, who worked on plumbing from Bunnings, watching his dad. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Daniel's an engineer. I mean, he's probably undersells himself. He's a really bright engineer who, in his PhD, had the idea of creating a pump which supports both sides of the heart simultaneously, or replaces both sides of the heart simultaneously, pumping around the lungs, pumping around the body simultaneously with one moving part. And so that's revolutionary sort of aspect to the pump. Having that concept, we're all very used to in our research running these sort of, we call them loops, mock loop circuits. And certainly my students also spend a good amount of money at Bunnings as well, patching things up and making things work. So it's all trying things out and just trying to get it to work.
That is so incredible. And you mentioned earlier that what is also really exciting about this, it not only worked on this Australian man, and he was the first in the world to have it for 100 days and to be discharged from hospital, but this technology and this pump and this success is now going to actually change, well, you're hoping it will change the need for human heart donors entirely long term. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so at the moment, it is a bridge to transplant. What we're doing in this trial, and the reason for the trial, is to make sure the technology works. So we've got to be sure that if we're committing this to someone long term, that it will do the job. Now, in the short term, I'm sure they work short term. We've shown that in America. This is our first step long term, out to 3 months. We really need to run it for longer than that even, out to 12 months, 2 years and that sort of thing, before we can really start to talk about it as an alternative to transplant. But the other thing that needs to happen that we're not quite there yet is the pump still has an external control, external batteries. And the next sort of phase of where this pump needs to go is to really incorporate all of that hardware internally. And so you've got a battery on the inside that can be charged wirelessly, just like we charge our iPhone wirelessly. So charge that over the skin and then have everything, the controller and the battery inside. So that's also a big step that will need to happen before we can start to talk about it as a transplant alternative. So there's a lot of work to do then, and it's not going to be next year, 5 years, hopefully 10 years, hopefully way before 10 years. But I think it's a big ask to compete with transplants, which have excellent outcomes. So we need to acknowledge that the bar is set pretty high for this pump to be better than a transplant.
So, Professor, for this Australian man that was used and had great success with this titanium heart as basically a stopgap before the transplant, he has now undergone a heart transplant. Is that correct? And it's been very successful?
Yeah. So, I mean, that was, it's always unexpected. You don't know when a transplant's going to happen. That's part of the nature of the beast. But it was less than a week ago. And so he's recovering well. So that's the thing about transplants. You can't line them up and say you're going to do that. at such and such a time. And sometimes you need these stopgap measures. And obviously, if we did have something on the shelf, then we could schedule, well, we'll do this next Thursday or whatever.
So this good news, is this going to then open the door for other people that need that stopgap measure? Can they then have this option now of this titanium heart?
Yeah, in the immediate term, it's going to be within the context of this, what's called early feasibility study, where we hope to implant up to 5 patients here in Australia. And so we've implanted one here. There's also the Alfred Hospital down in Melbourne that's involved in the study. And so between St Vincent's and the Alfred, we'll implant 5 patients. And then the next step will be 15 patients and gradually build up bigger numbers, more experience, more confidence. And then once we can convince the FDA and the Australian TGA, then, we can make it more available for more patients.
Professor, congratulations on your work. This is extraordinary, to all of the researchers and doctors and specialists that were involved in this. And of course, also the inventor, which was Daniel Timms. Incredible work. Thanks so much for joining us and good luck for the future.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that.
That was Professor Chris Hayward from St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us so you don't miss any episodes or our deep dive of the day. You can also follow us on our socials, on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and also on TikTok and YouTube. You can just search The Listener Newsroom, which is spelled LISTNR. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company. See you tomorrow.